sleepy. They just got in last night I got a bunch of text messages at 1 a.m. about people are going home. I'm not sure I'll be there. And then this morning I did a quick re-ask, who's coming? So I have heard and I've seen so many fun pictures over this week of their trip, and I'm excited to hear about how it went. 400 years in Egypt. Generations shaped by slavery, control, and fear. Their worth had been measured by what they could produce and how completely they could submit. They knew what it was to live under a ruler who took their labor and their freedom, their children and their future. And then God answered their cries and they were made free. But freedom didn't immediately feel like abundance. Freedom took them from what was familiar into what was uncertain. In Egypt, they had known where they would sleep, what the next day would require. The wilderness offered freedom, but it did not offer guarantees. So perhaps we should not too quickly dismiss their fears. Their ancestors had once entered Egypt because Egypt was supposed to be the place of survival. In the days of Joseph, it had offered food during the famine, safety in crisis, and land on which to build a future. Egypt had once been the answer to their prayers. But the place of refuge soon became a place of oppression. What began as provision became control. What began as safety became suffering. Now Israel stood at the edge of another land described as good, as fruitful, as abundant. Why would they not wonder whether this land might also change? Why should they believe that abundance would not once again become suffering? Why should they trust that the God who had allowed generations of slavery would now keep them safe? These are not questions that should just be silenced with easy answers. Their fear had a history. Their fear had evidence. Their fear had names and stories and graves attached to it. The miracles had been real, yes. The sea had opened, bread had appeared in the wilderness, water had come in dry places, and a cloud guided them by day, and fire traveled with them by night. But miracles are not guarantees. The sea opening did not mean that every future battle would be won. Manna appearing did not mean hunger would never return. Water coming from a rock did not mean thirst would never again become the reality. The presence of God did not mean the absence of danger. And perhaps this is where faith becomes more honest. Faith is not the belief that nothing painful will ever happen. Faith is not confidence that God will always protect us from every suffering, loss, or uncertainty. Faith is not pretending that every promise comes with a predictable outcome. Rather, our faith is not shaped by certainty, but by the belief that the God who sustains us in the midst of all that is uncertain will be there. To trust God is not to believe that all is well in this moment. Rather, it is to believe that the God who sat with them in slavery, who walked them out of Egypt, who heard them when they were hungry and thirsty, who remained present in the wilderness, was still present. Still present in the in-between, still active when nothing could be made firm, still God in the middle of questions that could not easily be resolved. The wilderness became more than the space between Egypt and the land. It became a place of formation. This formerly enslaved people had to learn that they were no longer Pharaoh's property. They had to learn that their worth was not determined by productivity. They had to learn that rest was holy, that there could be enough for everyone, and that freedom was more than release from oppression. Freedom was the long work of becoming a people who would not reproduce the very things that had harmed them. And now they were moments. They were steps from the place toward which they believed that God had been leading them. This was the land where they were going to plant roots. This was the place they were going to build homes and raise families. This was where they were going to create legacies. They were not simply looking for somewhere to live. They were trying to imagine whether a new life was possible. Could these formerly enslaved people build a community without becoming enslavers? Could people shaped by empire resist the temptation to create another empire? Could those who had experienced violence move into a new future without making violence the foundation of that future? And those questions mattered because the land they were going into was not empty. Other people had lived there. They had homes and histories, communities, and children of their own. And a faithful reading of this story cannot speak about taking the land as though the people who resided there didn't matter. We must refuse interpretations that turn conquest into a timeless and divine command, or use faith to justify displacement, erasure, or domination. The call to become God's people can never mean that others cease to be human. So the moral question is not simply whether Israel had enough faith to enter the land. The deeper question is, what kind of people would they be if they entered it? Would they embody a different way of living, or would they repeat the same patterns they had known? And all of those questions stood between them and the land. And so with the unknown before them, Moses sends 12 to explore what is before them. For 40 days, they walked through it. They examined the soil, they observed the cities, they studied the people, and they gathered the fruit. And what they found was both delightful and terrifying. The land was fertile, it was abundant. A cluster of grapes was so large that it had to be carried on a pole between two people. The evidence was undeniable. This land could sustain life. Children could grow there, families could flourish here, generations could build homes here. But abundance was not the only thing that they saw. They also saw fortified cities. They also saw powerful communities. They saw people who appeared larger and stronger than they. They saw real dangers. And when they returned, they told the truth. They said, "We entered the land you sent us to explore, and it does indeed flow with milk and honey." They showed the people the fruit. They testified to the abundance. But then they also spoke about the walls. They spoke about the strength of the people and the size of the cities. They spoke of how small and vulnerable they felt. They said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." And we often treat that very sentence as this evidence of distorted faith. But perhaps it was also the language of a people who had encountered great trauma. Maybe this is the language of people who had been treated as small, often left to feel small even after the chains were gone. Perhaps these are people who have been told that they are powerless, and they do not immediately become confident because someone announces they are free. Perhaps these are people who have survived generations of domination, and they may see danger before they can see possibility. Their fear didn't come from nowhere. The walls were real. The military power was real. Their vulnerability was real. Faith did not require them to deny what they had seen. Faith did not require them to pretend that the risks were imaginary. Faith did not erase the stories and memories that had brought them this far. The 10 were telling the truth. They were acknowledging the reality on the ground, the fear in their hearts, and the experiences of their past. Their warnings were not foolish. Every fear, though, should not be obeyed, but every fear deserves to be heard. Caleb and Joshua, however, the two, saw that same land, the same people, the same walls, and the same obstacles, and they did not possess any kind of secret information. They were not standing in a different place. They were looking at the same reality, and they reached a different conclusion. The 10 remembered the suffering, but the 2 remembered the sustaining presence of God. The 10 saw danger, the 2 saw possibility. The 10 knew that places of abundance could become places of oppression, but the 2 believed that the future could still be different. Both groups were responding to something real. And that is the tension in Numbers 13 and 14. What happens when hope and trauma speak at the same time? What happens when God leads us towards something new, but our history gives us good reasons to be cautious? What happens when the promise is real, but so is the risk? What happens when we cannot tell whether the next land will become a home or if it will become another Egypt? The answer simply cannot be just have more faith. Because sometimes fear is wisdom. Sometimes fear reminds us to move carefully. Sometimes fear identifies danger that enthusiasm overlooks. Sometimes the voices labeled as negative are the voices that are simply asking, is everyone going to be safe? But fear can also become a prison. Fear can also convince us that because suffering happened, nothing new is possible. Fear can protect us from danger, but it can also keep us from transformation. Fear may keep us alive, but it is no way to live. So the invitation is not to just eliminate fear. The invitation is to discern what fear is telling us. Is fear warning us about a genuine danger? Is it asking us to prepare more carefully? Is it exposing an injustice we have ignored? Or is fear repeating the old message that we are powerless, insignificant, and incapable of change? Is fear simply telling us that we are unworthy of a new way of being, that we lack the value required to be made fear? Faith doesn't need to silence fear. Faith brings fear into the conversation with grace and curiosity. It listens to our wounds, not so they can hold us back, but so we can discern whether it is harm or it is love that is inviting us to take the next step. And that was Israel's struggle. Their fear was understandable. The walls were real. Their vulnerability was real. Their memories of oppression were real. But instead of allowing fear to become a tool of discernment, they allowed it as a reason and a rationale to stand still. Fear stopped being one voice in the conversation, and it became the final voice. Rather than asking, what must we understand? What must we prepare for? What must we do differently? They concluded, we cannot go. And that is the danger of fear. Sometimes fear can help us see clearly, but it was never meant to decide that nothing new is possible. There's an old hymn that many of us know, and I didn't know the story, but many of you may know it, from It Is Well With My Soul. The author, Horatio Spafford, wrote its words following a series of devastating loss. His son had died from an illness, his business was destroyed by a fire, and then in 1873, sending his wife and girls for a trip across the Atlantic, their ship sank. His wife survived, but their daughters died. Spafford later crossed the Atlantic to join his grieving wife. And tradition holds that as his ship passed near the place where his daughters had died, the words of the hymn began to take shape. The hymn speaks of sorrow rolling like waves. He didn't pretend that sorrow didn't exist. He did not say the scene was calm when it was not. Faith had not erased the loss or made the circumstances more acceptable. It as well did not mean everything was as it should be, but it meant sorrow would not be the only truth by which he lived. It meant that when he could not trust the circumstances, he could still reach toward the God who remained present within them. And that is the difference between the 10 and the 2. Caleb and Joshua saw the same land, the same walls, and the same danger. They were not less informed and perhaps not even less afraid, but they refused to allow fear to become a command to stand still. The 10 asked, what if everything that harmed us before happens again? And the 2 asked, what if the God who sustained us before remains with us now? That is not certainty. It is the stubborn hope that the past does not possess the authority to determine every future, every step, every possibility that is still waiting to be born. When fear does not take over, we can hold on to the remnants of faith that say, God is still unfolding something within us and around us. More than we can ask, imagine, more than fear can see. Our circumstances are real. Our sorrow and our trauma, our vulnerability and past horrors are all part of the story. We do not need to deny their reality, but faith invites us to imagine and to hope, to pray and to believe that there just might be more. But faith cannot remain only within the one. John Lewis tells this story from his book, Walking with the Wind. When Lewis was about 4 years old, he was inside his aunt's home in Alabama with about 15 cousins and some young relatives when a powerful storm begins to shake the house and one corner of the house begins to lift. Now, his aunt doesn't say, sit still, sit down, don't worry about it. She doesn't say to ignore the wind or to pretend that the house is steady. Instead, she gathers the children together. They held hands and they moved towards the corner that was rising, using their collective weight to help stabilize it. When the wind shifted, they moved again. They could not stop the wind, they could not control the storm, but they could pay attention. They could hold on to one another, and they could move toward the places where their presence was needed most. Lewis later uses that story as a picture of what he calls the beloved community. And this morning among us in this space, our own beloved community, some of us are the crowd who are listening to the 10 and the 2. Some of us are among the 10. We can see what is shaking. We recognize the uncertainty and we are unafraid to name it. We ask the questions others would avoid, and we notice the people whose safety might be overlooked. And then there's some of us who are the 2. When the house is shaking, when the wind is rising, when the past threatens to overtake the future, there are a few people who still move and live as though God will sustain us, despite the reality that the 10 have put before us. Sometimes the 2 are the only ones who hold hope in the room. And so we need those who name danger, but we must not ignore those who can still imagine a new and faithful way forward. We need those who listen to fear, and we need those who refuse to let fear have the final word. The 2 lead us toward the corner of the house that is lifting. Not because they are certain that the house will stand, but because love requires them to move toward the place where their presence is needed. They are the ones who never stop asking these 2 questions. The same 2 questions that I hope you will ask. What is my fear asking me to notice? And what is love asking me to do? Is fear identifying an actual danger? Is it asking you to prepare more carefully? Is it exposing an injustice or showing you that someone's safety has been overlooked? Or has fear simply become a stumbling block, something that has stopped you from discerning and started convincing you that you can never move. Maybe love is asking you to wait. Maybe love is asking you to prepare. Maybe love is asking you to speak or to protect someone. Maybe love is asking you to reach for someone's hand and move towards the corner of the house that is lifting. And maybe love is asking you to take one careful, faithful step into something new. We do not move because we are certain. We move because the God who sustained us before is still here. The sea may not be calm. The walls may still be standing. The wind may still be blowing. Everything may not be well yet, but God is still here. Love is still calling, and we are not alone. The worship team can come up. Fear does not have to leave us standing forever at the edge of what could be. We can listen. We can discern. We can hold on to one another. And with trembling voices and tested hope, we can take the next faithful steps that love is calling us into. Trusting that even here, even in this, even among us, even now in this moment, it can still be declared, it is well with our souls.